So thank you so much for joining us for Impact State of Mind. I'm John Paul Parmigiani, CEO and co-founder of Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area. Impact Hub New York Metropolitan Area is a nonprofit supporting entrepreneurs and change makers through programs designed to help impactful ideas succeed. We work across the New York metropolitan area broadly, with focus areas in Manhattan, Queens, Newark, and Morristown, New Jersey. Impact Hub is a global association of more than 100 entrepreneurial communities in more than 50 countries around the world. Impact State of Mind is a virtual series created to support and inspire innovators during the COVID-19 crisis. So thank you so much for joining us for today's session, which is interview with Kim Worsham, who is founder of Flush. Kim, it is a true honor to have you with us here today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you guys.
So I was hoping you could maybe start us off by telling us about Flush, the vision, the overall goals as they may relate to the SDGs.
Sure. So Flush is a new company, and what we try to do ultimately is build the progress in sanitation and hygiene in the world by facilitating learning in two main different ways. So the two big things that we do are we provide advisory services to organizations, funders, and social enterprises working in sanitation and hygiene in particular, as well as water, to really help them build up their capacities from a management point of view in hopes to unlock finance. But then we also provide facilitated learning by edutainment events for the general public to try to engage people about sanitation and destigmatize the conversations we have in the public around sanitation, so people feel more comfortable talking about sanitation so that we can raise awareness and hopefully bring change a little faster than what's happening today. And really, if you're thinking about the overall goals of the SDGs, I'm really focusing on SDG 6, particularly 6.1 and 6.2. But I also, sanitation kind of goes across many different SDGs in a lot of sense. So I also kind of look at SDGs like number 4 and number 12, 13, 7, we could keep going.
And why are you so passionate about this work? What's the path that's led you to go down this route?
So I was a little kid with a lot of GI issues, and I was always going to the bathroom all the time, to the point where my family joked that I was like the restaurant inspector, where before we would go sit down at restaurants, I would go inspect the toilet before we sat down to make sure it was up to my personal code of standards, because I was going to use it. And fast forward to when I became, a young adult, and I was really struggling to find out the cause I was most passionate about to work in. I was interested in women's rights and economic development and education, but I felt like I couldn't really hold myself to any of them because I loved them all dearly. And then I found water and sanitation as, a really big cause globally that had to be looked at. And I realized it was kind of like the perfect access of all of the stuff that I cared about. So sanitation is related to women's rights, is related to education and health and economic opportunity. So kind of almost like I came full circle when I was about 22 and really realized, especially with someone with GI disorders, the idea that there are people in the world who may have the same disorders as I do, who may not be able to use a toilet, or who may not have easy access to a toilet or to a safe toilet, really impassioned me to want to get into this and make sure that people had access. And then working overseas in water and sanitation and getting my own parasites and other waterborne diseases really has kind of sealed the deal on my passion for access to clean water and safe toilets. So yeah, it kind of came around that way. I actually thought I was going to be an entertainment, like a media producer, like a movie producer or something. And then I found myself suddenly enthralled by the idea of talking about toilets all the time. So the path is very odd, not a straight line, but that's generally, I guess it started quite young.
I guess there's always the opportunity to take that passion for movie production and bring it to sanitation as well, right? So maybe
sure.
So you never know. It's not too late to merge those passions.
Yeah, I'll call Matt Damon up.
Yeah, exactly. So I was wondering if you could tell us, so then is your work entirely focused on developing countries or?
Yeah, I actually started my career thinking I was going to work in low and middle income countries primarily. And then I realized as I was looking into water and sanitation that actually no country is immune to water and sanitation issues. And if we look at even in the US, we have 10% of the US doesn't have access to safe, reliable toilets. So if we think about that's 350 million people total, that's about 35 million people in the US alone that have poor access to toilets. So, one of the things I'm definitely trying to make sure Flush works on is being a little more geographically agnostic and emphasizing that just because you live in a high income country doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about how to improve the water and sanitation systems in your country. And I really think that COVID has kind of shined a light on that recently, that we in the US and in other Western parts of the world really have to figure out certain things better than we have in the past. I think there's this assumption a lot of the times when we talk about water and sanitation or in general, like innovations in the world. And there's this assumption that the high income countries have really figured it out and we're trying to bestow that knowledge to low and middle income countries, when really, it's kind of, we've coasted for about 150 years on water and sanitation. And now we're starting to see a lot of these pain points, particularly when we talk about the environment. And we're also starting to see how certain communities in the US even have, diarrheal disease issues because of poor access to safe sanitation. And you go to other countries like in Kenya or in Ghana where they have these issues, but in some ways they're also quite a lot more innovative and they're finding opportunities to leapfrog from kind of doing the old-timey things that we've done for 150 years in the Western world and really going beyond it and finding better things that we can do with sanitation, which I think is really cool. So I try to do both. And sometimes I have like the Venn diagram that shows that sometimes there's not that much of a difference between the developing world and the Western world.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Especially, in recent years in the New York metropolitan area, we have had a multitude of issues related to accessible and clean water and some of the areas around the city and then within the city around sanitation and also access to public toilets. And that gets extra complicated this year with the COVID crisis, right? Where it's harder to make use of all the existing infrastructure that relates to using the restroom for multitudes of people because of the fear that people have of letting people inside buildings and so forth. And so that seems really timely. Actually, I was wondering if you want to maybe build on that a little bit and give us maybe a flavor of some of the issues that are like now occurring, here locally.
New York has a couple things going on that need to get challenged. And you brought up one of them, John Paul, really well, which is public toilets are becoming quite an acute problem in a lot of urban places, particularly in New York. I mean, New York City has about 4,000 people living on the streets at any given time they've figured out. And if we look at the number of public toilets we have for those people to access, it's, I think, maybe 12 or 36. It's not that many for a couple thousand people. And even though we all have to, pardon my French, we all shit every day, no matter what, and yet those people don't really have places to go, what other options do they have but to open defecate? Which a lot of the times when people think about that, it's like, oh, that's something that happens in Cambodia, not here. But that's not true, because if we don't give people those opportunities to, have a dignified, safe place to go, we're going to have public health issues that go beyond COVID. Something like hepatitis A, that's a really contagious disease, can easily spread in an urban setting like New York if we don't have access to toilets. And then if we talk about infrastructure, something that New York City really has a challenge with, and other cities in the US do as well, because they have old infrastructure. We have this thing called combined sewage overflow. And combined sewage overflow is basically this idea of how to protect our wastewater treatment plants from overloading when there's rainfall. So combined sewage means that the stormwater drains from our streets when it rains, collects the same place where we flush our toilets. So in order to prevent the treatment plant from not getting overwhelmed during rainstorms, it just goes straight into the waterways. So when you go to the Hudson River or the Harlem River or the East River in New York, after it rains, you shouldn't go into the water or really go near it just because there's raw sewage in it. And it's, some people think it's this nefarious thing about the government's trying to, want to, pull the wool over our eyes on something, but it's really just a sign of a really old system that we've, again, really coasted on having, that we've really not worked on building, on fixing very much. So there are efforts to kind of clean up that by putting in, remediation efforts, putting in ways to collect the raw sewage before it goes into the waterways. But again, we're still talking about raw sewage in waterways in, one of the richest cities in the world, which is just always very wild to me. And yet no one wants to talk about the fact that there's shit in the water.
Well, we want to talk about it. So I'm actually curious, what are some of the barriers that you think are for tackling that right now? Is it a willingness? Is it just so many things happening, from this standpoint that need to be solved immediately that diverts attention, or what's the deal?
It's all of the above. So I think, well, first of all, when we talk about infrastructure like sewers and wastewater treatment plants, they're really expensive. And I think that's something that people forget. They're really expensive, but also it takes a really long time to build them. They're very, capital intensive. There's a lot of money that has to get pulled into them. And people are just, who aside from John Oliver really wants to have, a wastewater treatment plant named after them. It's not something that people want to be known for as, oh, I'm the person who invested in the sewers. It's not glamorous as opposed to like, building a hospital. So I think there's this political will and this kind of investor will in putting money into it, but also right now, the way the systems work, it's not a very lucrative business. So a lot of places are really reluctant to put the money into it just because, the tenor of like a loan to go into that kind of investment would have to take a longer time than say an easy one with if you look at fintech or ed tech and you have these kind of 5 to 7 year returns on investments. For infrastructure like sewers and wastewater, it's more like 20 to 30 years, which a lot of people are really reluctant to invest in. So it's that, but it's also if we want to, fix the systems we have, we actually have to literally, dig up the ground sometimes to get to fixing and updating it. So there's also this idea of really creating an inconvenience for people to improve their lives. You have to make their lives kind of a living hell for a while to improve the infrastructure by, in New York, what we have is something, I think it's called MS3 or MS4. I always get wrong how many S's there are, but there's a lot of S's. So what they're trying to do is, in some places separate the stormwater drains from the toilet and the sink flushing drains. And again, you're literally, digging up the ground to put in newer sewer systems, and it costs a couple $1 billion. So, it's that, but again, also, I don't know a lot of people who are openly talking about toilets in New York, except for I can think of a handful of people or organizations that are really advocating for that. And they tend to be people really advocating for, the rights of people who are houseless. And again, that's not something that a lot of people want to get behind. So there's like this social challenge as well of having this idea of, oh, it's a problem for people over there instead of it being a problem for everybody.
Well, it sounds like people should be paying attention to it, and hopefully your work will help to continue to bring more visibility to the issue. But like shifting gears a little bit on the innovation side, what are some of the innovations in sanitation across the world that you're most excited about? And maybe some of these can actually help us here too.
I am pretty nerdy when it comes to my innovation excitements. When it comes to toilets, there's a couple things that are really cool that are happening in other parts of the world and in some parts of the U.S., maybe in the Pacific Northwest specifically, where we're really looking at how do we actually take out the water part of our toilets. So having something like a compost toilet or a toilet that diverts, our urine from our poo, where, that makes it a lot easier to compost it and make it fertilizer. There's, about half of the US's, wastewater biosolids, which is basically like the dried up poo, that goes into applying for, goes into fields, goes into some agricultural purposes, but a lot of it, maybe a fourth of it, goes into landfill. So there's a lot of cool innovation in the world of looking at how do we actually create a resource out of what's in our toilets? Can we make it into energy? The answer is yes. Can we make it into fertilizer? The answer is yes. And, when I was doing some work in Kenya, there's a lot of really cool work doing a multi-pronged system of, creating energy, to help facilitate the energy in the wastewater treatment plant or the fecal sludge plant. This is something that we do in Newtown Creek in Brooklyn. That's kind of one of the things they do is they create energy from the wastewater to actually fuel the wastewater treatment plant, which I think is really neat. But other things they're doing is also creating animal feed out of the waste from our bodies. So I'm not going to get into the details just in case someone's eating lunch when they're watching this, but basically there's a way to create, you know, like bugs that you can dry and pack as a really high protein animal feed out of human waste, that I'm just like super excited about. I think it's really neat because animals, you know, like pork, what are they called? Pigs and chickens and fish, those guys have to eat something, and we can actually create a renewable source instead of, you know, struggling to figure out how to feed them, which is something that I know a lot of farmers have tried, who have really, you know, tried to figure out sustainable ways to feed our livestock. And it's really tricky to figure out how to do it without really damaging the environment. So that's something I'm really nerdy about. But then, you know, when we're talking about water-based systems, I'm also really excited. Japan and Singapore have been really big innovators when it comes to water-based systems. So in Singapore, one of the things they do is, you know, whatever water you flush down the toilet, it essentially will eventually get back into your tap and you can drink it, which is how water goes no matter what. All of the water we have is the same water that whoever, like, you know, Albert Einstein shat out. But a lot of people just don't like to have it kind of a close toilet to tap thing going on, but really that's what's going to happen eventually no matter what. But Singapore has really found really cool ways to recycle the water, to really make sure that the water system that they use really kind of facilitates the growing population there. And also in Japan, they've done this cool stuff that I don't know if it's happening here very much in the US, but they have like toilet sinks on top of the toilet. So you can wash your hands, and that water that you use to wash your hands can fill up the water tank instead of using clean drinking water, which again just blows my mind that we like flush all of this drinking water that we have to treat and then put in the toilet to treat again really quickly back into the wastewater plant. Just blows my mind. So this idea of like reusing our water systems, especially for the toilet, is something that I get really excited about. But unfortunately in the US, quite a lot of states either have regulations or codes that really make it hard for us to create those kinds of systems. It's called a gray water system. And it's really hard for some places, like I know in Georgia, they have some laws where you can't use gray water systems. So I don't even know if they could use those sinks on the toilet tank. So those are the things that I get really excited about, and really excited about, you know, if we're not going to be able to take the water out, at least can we reuse the water that we've been using at the household before we start flushing the toilet, so we don't waste so much water flushing all of our waste down the drain.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, it certainly sounds like there's a lesson to be learned here. I know that in different parts of the US, water is recycled from, you know, wastewater to drinking water, but it's not everywhere. And even that has many challenges and both quality and, you know, and public support, right? So, I mean, it's shocking to say that, but okay, so so first I want to remind people in the audience that, you know, feel free to ask questions and post them in the chat. We did have someone who looks like they are venting some frustration that there's so many people without access to sanitation, and you know, I guess there's the point about like counting them and making sure that we know who they are and how they can be addressed. I was wondering if you just wanted to speak to that quickly, so we can sort of address that comment.
It's interesting trying to figure out how to count people who don't have access sometimes, because a lot of people may not necessarily tell you if they have access or not. So getting those numbers can be tricky. When it comes to like in the US, the numbers, there's a study that was done by Dig Deep, which is a really great NGO in California that does work about water and sanitation in the US, where they worked with the US Water Alliance to try to figure out the number of people in the US without safe access to sanitation systems. Or rather without access to safe sanitation systems. Not saying that they don't have toilets, but maybe their toilets aren't safe. They're not safely managed. Maybe they're leaking into the groundwater or into their fields. And I believe it took them quite a few years to try to get those numbers. So when we look in other countries that I worked in, like lower middle income countries, a lot of it is, you know, doing some statistical inferences and trying to figure out, here's the population size. We use GIS to try to figure out the population size for an area and try to see how many people have access to a toilet. Can we figure that out? Can we go survey them? It can get quite tricky and quite complicated really quickly, especially when you don't have a sewer system, because the sewer system is a little easier, I guess, to do some calculations about how much wastewater you're getting, and maybe you can figure out how many toilets are connected to the sewer system. Whereas if it's all offline, if it's all like pits, toilet pits or outhouses, it gets a lot harder to make sure we have exact numbers. But I think the opportunity of using GIS data is really becoming a really interesting topic in the world of sanitation, especially just because it helps us also learn how to localize our intelligence, not just like at a national level, but also looking like in our community, in our county, where are the places that are, that should be looked at.
So this has been obviously a very tricky year in general for anybody who's doing anything, and just being around has been, an interesting, challenge. How has the COVID-19 crisis affected your work? And also, what kind of unique challenges does it pose for you as an entrepreneur?
Well, for the water and sanitation sector, it's interesting because we've kind of been the poor child of water crises about climate change. But now, because all of a sudden people are interested in hand washing, there's been a lot more focused on the hand washing side and the hygiene side of water and sanitation and hygiene issues, which is great to a degree. It's just sometimes it's been tricky to get the right messaging out or figuring out um, put out messaging that people resonate with. I think that's something that, we still struggle with. And I know when I look at projects that I've worked on in the past, or projects that I'm currently working on, a lot of the issues are the progress we were making to improve the system as a whole is really kind of halted in a lot of ways to try to do some more like emergency work. Like, how do we make sure that people in Kumasi, Ghana have access to a hand washing station where they may not have had that in the past? Instead of trying to make sure that there's like a system to put in sanitation, maybe there's been more of a focus on like, how do we get the hand washing basins and access to water? So it's kind of, it's all the same issue, but now we're kind of looking more at like, how do we fix it right now? Whereas a lot of my focus has been looking at how do we fix the system so that we can actually progress forward and move on and be able to get sustainable access for people, and make sure that the access is sustainable in terms of being able to use it forever, but is also environmentally sustainable, and also financially sustainable. I could keep going. So I think those are like the big issues in the sector is we've really kind of had this emergency setting coming on, whereas now it's like, okay, well, how do we integrate that into making sure this isn't just like a one-off and after COVID ends, all of the hand washing basins go away and people still don't have access to toilets. So that's a big issue. For me as an entrepreneur, Flush has struggled a little bit this year because it's hard to get people interested in looking at systems change when we're trying to figure out how to make sure we minimize the damage of COVID, especially with the hand washing stations. So, there's been a lot of conversations like, yeah, that's great, we can do that later, but right now we're just trying to make sure we prevent as much transmission of disease as possible, which is totally valid. It just makes it a little harder for me as an entrepreneur to get business in. But the nice thing is Flush has been able to pivot really hard on really emphasizing on the educational events, the edutainment events, and making sure we put out a lot of information. So while people are stuck at home, trying to build that knowledge base so that when we can actually get closer to a place where we can have these longer, more sustainable conversations, people will be a little more better equipped to kind of have those conversations. But it's tricky. I mean, I can't say it's helped us financially, this COVID stuff, because we can't meet with people, which is challenging. It's really hard to have conversations about water and sanitation online if we can't, go figure out what the actual problems are in the field with people or on the ground. Like, I can't go to Alabama and figure out how people's septic tank systems are working, or I can't go to Ghana and do the same things.
Got it. So you do have some events coming up, right?
Yeah. So the big adult event I have coming up is on the 28th of October. I'll be teaching a class with the Brooklyn Brainery about public toilets. So it's kind of a social justice class, but it talks about like the history of public toilets and why we need to create more safe spaces. So I talk a little bit about that New York City public toilet issue in there. So I recommend people, reaching out to me, kim@flushwash.org, if you are curious. We also have a newsletter that we put out some of these events on our website, but also on our newsletter. So feel free to go to our website and subscribe, or again, you can email me and ask. I also Flush has started producing classes for kids. So we work with OutSchool and we do some toilet classes for kids. Right now it's 3 to 10. So we have 2 different kinds of classes that just teach kids about the basics of toilets. I have 3 coming up, 2 for 7 to 10-year-olds and 1 for 3 to 6-year-olds in the next month. I cannot remember the dates, but they're all on Fridays. So if you feel free to email me, and I'm happy to give that information.
Sounds like Fridays are just getting better and better.
Or shitty, depends on how you think of it.
Right. Okay. So then how can people support your work? How can they get involved? What else do you need that can maybe advance the work that you do that's very important?
I think one of the big things is people come to my classes and also tell me what kinds of classes you want. Flush is trying to build out this kind of big toolbox of classes for people to learn about sanitation, but not just about toilets. Also, we want to make sure people start learning about like solid waste, like trash and garbage, because that's also sanitation. And it's very related to toilets in a lot of odd ways. So we're always curious to figure out, what kinds of things do people want to learn about? Do you want to learn about, weird toilets that happened in the past that we don't see anymore? Do you want to learn about, trash issues and how they relate to toilets? Let me know, let Flush know what kinds of things you want to learn. We will produce those classes. And also hire us for some classes. We do private events as well for people, especially for organizations that are interested in getting their staff, a fun kind of quirky lunch conversation, but also if they're trying to do professional development or community building. That's something that we're big on doing. Also help us learn, if there's an organization that needs some help with their data systems and they work in water and sanitation, let us know. This is something that we're really big on doing for advisory services. We're also really big on creating stories and trying to help organizations working in water and sanitation. We want them to help us help them by having them have us come over and help them drive stories that make them compelling and interesting for people. So those are some of the big ways. Also, letting your friends know that there's a toilet class once in a while is really helpful. A lot of the people who come to our classes are through word of mouth.
Got it. Well, we have a great question from the audience from Carol McCreary, who asks, how can New Yorkers advocate for toilet availability? Why have they gotten stuck? How do you move the needle?
It's an interesting question, and I think it's a much longer conversation than we have in a minute. But I definitely think that New Yorkers should definitely start advocating for toilet availability with public toilets by talking to their council members and really starting to create a buzz with their council members and putting that pressure of, we really want to start seeing public toilets available more, and having questions of, why don't we have public toilets in this area? Where can we put them? It's a much bigger conversation about urban planning, like where do you put it in zoning? How do you make sure that you can get the land to put it on, and how to make sure that it stays clean? But these are things that people can start asking their council members to start getting it on the public agenda. It's really not right now. From what I've seen, there's a good student-run advocacy program called Restrooms for All in New York City that's really trying to figure out how to get politicians and businesses to start thinking about opening up public toilet spaces. There's also some cool programs about having businesses like restaurants and stuff get a government subsidy to actually open up their toilets for public use. And I think that could be something that, people could ask, is that something possible in New York City? I think that'd be a really cool opportunity. They do it in Germany. We could try it here.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. I know we're out of time, but it's been a real honor to have the chance to hear more about your story and your work. And it's such important work. So we're really grateful for the contribution you're making both here and abroad. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Well, take care, everyone, and everyone in the audience as well. And we'll see you next week.